You might think that modern skepticism about Jesus is a new thing, something that came up with YouTube documentaries and TikTok hot takes, or maybe even popular books that say the Gospels are full of legends. We'll spend this series responding to that long history of skepticism by zooming in on a few key questions. Questions like, are the Gospels anonymous legends, or do they really go back to named authors with access to eyewitnesses? We don't even know who wrote the Gospels. They're anonymous. You've probably heard this line before. You hear it on TikTok, you see it in documentaries. It shows up in casual conversations. The idea is simple. If we don't know who wrote these documents, why should we trust what they say about Jesus? Now imagine this in any other area of life. Imagine a big story breaking in the news, but the article has no author, no source, no track record. You'd be suspicious, right? But if an influencer you know, whose work you can trust, you can trace, you can test, if they publish a story or post a story with named sources, you weigh this story very differently. So here's the tension. If the Gospels are really just anonymous stories that floated around for decades, that should definitely affect how seriously we take them, right? If there's any good reason to think that these books go back to specific people in the earliest Christian movement, people connected to eyewitnesses, well, that changes everything forever. It changes the entire conversation. In this episode, we're going to slow down and ask, who actually wrote the Gospels? Welcome back to Online Podcast. Let's dive right in. Let's start with a simple question. Why does authorship matter? It is in fact the kind of things that scholars argue about in the library. Well, in real life, we care about who's talking all the time. If you see a post on social media with a wild claim, but no source, no context, no name, you're particularly cautious about such posts, right? In journalism, credibility is tied to the track record and transparency about a source. When you're in a courtroom, the most powerful moments are when an eyewitness takes the stand and say, I was there. I saw this. I remember back in college when one of my friends got into a situation and, there were a few of us there present and a couple was involved. So the thing that happened was that there was only one cop who showed up. Now, every one of us just agreed that, it's not that big a deal. We're just going to let it go. But there was this one of my friends who decided, I know it was a big deal. He wanted to take this matter head on, and he did. Followed the matter all the way to a court. And one day I remember him coming back home and telling us that, the judge had requested that whoever, either himself or the cop, whoever could bring an eyewitness to corroborate their story, he was going to rule in the favor of whoever brought the eyewitness. Again, the thing about the cop was that he was the only one who showed up. But my friend had multiple eyewitnesses, and he only needed one. That day, I remember being in court and just hearing the testimony of the eyewitness. As soon as the eyewitness was done, just like the judge said, he ruled in favor of my friend, simply because he brought an eyewitness who corroborated the story from the beginning to the end. The same instincts apply here. When we're dealing with ancient history, we have to look at eyewitnesses. If we want to know something about any figure from the past, the first thing we ask is, who is telling us the story? How closely were they to the event? And what motives might they have if these narratives were to make it out? So when it comes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the question is not an abstract puzzle, it's about weight. If these books really come from people in the orbit of the apostles and eyewitnesses, then their portrait of Jesus deserves a significantly different kind of attention. More attention than we've ever given any anonymous story. Definitely more attention if they were stitched together by anonymous eyewitnesses centuries later. Today, we're not trying to prove everything about the gospel. We're simply asking, is it fair to keep repeating the statement, we have no idea who wrote the gospels? Or is there more to the story? So, are the Gospels anonymous? Here's where definitions matter. It is true that inside the text, none of the four Gospels contain a verse where the author explicitly say, I, Matthew, I, Mark, and so on, as the author of the book. In that regard, and that regard only, the Gospels are technically anonymous in their original texts. For instance, the name Matthew, right, only appears as a character in the book in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, not as the author defining or identifying himself. Mark is not even mentioned in the gospel text itself. And Luke comes the closest to sounding like an author. And I'll read what it says in Luke chapter 1, from verse 1 to verse 4. It says, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set an order narrative, it seemed good to me also to write to you an orderly account. He says me, but he doesn't give his name. John is indirect, but still not explicit. In John chapter 21, verse 24, he says, this is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. He was referring to verse 20, where he referred to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. And the early church identified that this was not just an author, but he was also the disciple John. So where did the name, the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to Luke, and the gospel according to John, where did this name come from? These titles were attached to the manuscript by the early church, not in the first line of the narrative by the authors. They were early, unanimous, and never disputed attributes in the early church. The authors of the gospel did something. They made sure to stay in the background. They made sure to emphasize Jesus and not themselves. They ensured to be apostolic in their writings. That is what people mean when they say the Gospels are anonymous. They mean that the authors don't identify themselves in the body of the text. In the ancient world, it was common for works to circulate with titles or attributes that everyone in the community knew, even if the author didn't sign their name to the first paragraph. When we look at the early Christian movement, we don't find a random scatter of names attaching to the gospel. We find a remarkably consistent pattern. And here's the pattern. Matthew was associated with only one gospel. Mark was also associated with just one gospel. Luke was associated with another one, and John with another one. All four of them, different early Christian voices in different places, echoing the same attributes. That doesn't magically remove every question, and it doesn't mean that there's zero debate, but it pushes back against the idea that the names were slapped on the manuscript centuries later by marketers trying to boost their sales. See, the thing is, if this were about anyone else from history with a long and consistent link to eyewitnesses, scholars would see the connection, especially to eyewitness, as a strong evidence. The point here is not to say case closed, but it is to ask why with the Gospels, we sometimes move the goalpost and pretend that consistent early attributions based on eyewitness testimonies count for nothing. Let's talk about how early communities even kept track of who wrote what. The first Christians did not live in a digital world like we do right now, right? They lived in a tight-knit community. In these communities, teaching was passed down by memory, repetition, and public reading. When a church received the gospel, it didn't just float around as a mysterious text. What typically happened is that it was read aloud, it was copied, and then shared with an understanding of where it came from. For example, Paul stated this in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16. It says that when this epistle is read among you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from the Laodiceans. Although Paul's letter to the church in Laodicea is not included as a book in the New Testament Bible, it paints a picture, though, of how leaders in those early communities, I'm talking about pastors, bishops, teachers, how they would often introduce the manuscript they're reading or the manuscript they're about to read. It will be something like this. This is the gospel Matthew handed down to us. Or this is the account that came from Mark, who worked with Peter. Or in this case, this is the letter of Paul to the Laodicean church as he stated in his letter to us in Colossae. Those statements became part of an oral and written memory of the early church. Here's a fact. They knew these people, or they have had interactions with people who encountered them. For instance, in Acts chapter 8, the Bible talks about the Ethiopian eunuch and his encounter of Philip. Let's pause for a second and think about who Philip was. Philip was close to the disciples. Or in Acts chapter 10, Cornelius encountered Peter, and it was stated that the entire household of Cornelius met Peter. Remember, Peter was one of the closest disciples to Jesus. When historians today look at any ancient tradition, they ask these questions. Do different sources in different locations report the same thing about the authorship? Are there early voices close to the event making those claims? Or is there any evidence of competing attributions? For example, one group saying this was by Matthew and another saying this was by someone else. These are the things that today's historians look at. With the Gospels, what is striking is not chaos, but convergence. The same four names keep resurfacing, and we don't see serious alternatives claiming that the Gospel was written by someone completely different. Again, this doesn't prove in a mathematical way that every detail is nailed down. However, in any other area of ancient history, converging early testimonies like this would definitely carry real weight. The same four names in different places, echoing the same attributions. At this point, it is important to avoid an all or nothing trap. Sometimes the conversation about the Gospels can sound like this. Either we can prove with absolute certainty every detail about who wrote them and how they used their sources, or we know nothing and everything is up for grabs. That's not how historians normally work. In almost every ancient case, we're dealing with probabilities, we're dealing with converging lines of evidence, we're dealing with reasonable judgment about how close a source is to the event that it describes. So the question with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's not are they perfect? The question is, how close were they to the people who were actually there? Do they bear the markings of people who either saw these things or carefully collected the testimonies of people who did? If the answer to any of this is yes, or even probably yes, then I believe we can dismiss the idea or the notion of the gospel being anonymous legends. If we are able to confidently say that the people who wrote the Gospels were people who were actually close to the event, and these writings in fact bear the markings and the language of the time, the historically proven tradition of the time of a people who either saw these things or carefully collected the testimonies of those who did, then we can trust the authors of the Gospel. It doesn't mean anyone is getting forced into faith, but what it does mean is that an honest seeker should at least treat these texts as serious historical witnesses, not as random religious fan fiction. You don't have to leave this episode convinced that every traditional claim about authorship is true, but maybe, just maybe, you can leave with a more nuanced question. If the Gospels are at least rooted in the testimony of real people close to Jesus, what would it take for me to take their claims seriously? Hold that tension. You don't have to rush into a conclusion. Just be willing to admit if the evidence is stronger than the slogans that you have heard all your life. As we wrap up this episode, here's a question I want to leave with you. If the Gospels are not just anonymous legends, but are at least plausibly connected to real people in the earliest Christian movement, people who either saw Jesus or walked with those who did, what would it take for you to take their testimonies seriously? I'm not asking you to agree with every line. Neither am I asking you to have every question answered. I just want you to say, these are serious historical witnesses and I owe them an honest hearing. Maybe for you, the next step is simply opening one of the Gospels again and reading it with fresh eyes, with fresh questions. If this really comes from someone close to the event, what is this person trying to tell me about Jesus? Wherever you are on the spectrum of skepticism, maybe you're curious, you're convinced, or you're somewhere in between, thank you for being willing to think this through with me. Truly, thank you. If this episode stirred any questions or pushback, please send them in. I would like to hear from you, and I would love to address some of these questions in future episodes or maybe a bonus Q&A conversation. Thank you for listening to Align Podcast. Cheers.